it's the outliers that happen. Like in the case of this, like here's a kid who, as an officer, he's a leader. He's doing all these things on the side that nobody's talking about, or nobody knew about, or some people knew about him. And if it's found out that instructors knew that he was cheating, then I think that's obviously a huge problem that I'm pretty sure will get resolved. But if it turns out that it was a kid that was self-dosing with drugs to try to make it through a program, I don't know if the program itself should be forced to change because of one guy.
Greetings, everybody. Today's episode is a fun one. It's an interesting one. It is our sort of first go at a little bit of investigative journalism. Alex, who are we having on today?
This is a cool one. If you follow the stories, you might have seen some hints about what we were going to dive into. Drew will get into the specifics of the current events we're dealing with in a second, but you may have seen an article about a death in buds that occurred this past winter. I think it occurred around February and the news broke during the summer. But we brought someone on uniquely qualified to talk about that particular incident. We're talking to Jamie Monroe. He was a Navy SEAL from the mid-90s through the early 2000s, and he served on SEAL Team 1. After doing a bunch of cool guy stuff, he went and got an MBA from Pepperdine and started pursuing some entrepreneurial projects, including one in particular that stands out a little bit. Apparently, if you can be a SEAL, you really can do anything, because one of his first business projects after that was he opened a hair salon and spa that quickly grew to be the largest in Eastern Washington.
Very Navy SEAL of him, if you know any of the stereotypes around Navy SEALs.
You got to have good flow, and he knows all about it. But following that, he quickly got involved in both like the recreational and competitive sports industries. He's done quite a bit of race directing, mostly in the San Diego area, and more recently sportscasting, where he even won an Emmy.
An Emmy, our first Emmy award-winning guest.
There you go. His current roles include co-chair for USA Obstacle Racing, part-time production work for NBC Sunday Night Football, and then president of two of his own entrepreneurial projects, Easy Day Sports and Ready Fit. Hopefully, if everything goes well, we'll be telling you guys soon about some of the cool stuff Ready Fit is doing. And then throughout this whole time, he's also volunteered to mentor aspiring SEALs as they prepare for buds. So he's still in the community and like really cares about the program and making sure it stays good and all that kind of stuff. We brought him on because he wanted to voice kind of the perspective that he didn't think was getting covered enough in the news, share kind of a competing perspective.
Yeah. So the specific article that we're looking at was published by the New York Times in August 30th specifically. And if you Google death in Navy SEAL training, you'll pretty easily find it. It's behind a paywall, but there's ways around that. And essentially what they looked at was one of the candidates made it through Hell Week and then passed away almost immediately after. And the investigation into that incident led to sort of a snowball effect where they discovered, I guess we could probably say, rampant performance enhancing drug use by students engaged in the course. And so obviously there's a lot to unpack there. For us, kind of, there's two avenues into that. There's the tactical side of things, but then there's also the human performance side of things. And we dive into both of those with Jamie. As with any, I think it's safe to say that as with any news article, they tend to be on one side of things versus another. And so, like Alex mentioned, one of the reasons we wanted to have him on was to give kind of an alternative perspective. But what we'll say to you guys is that our hope is that we're able to do a little bit more digging into this and kind of bring a little bit more of this to light, both on the Navy side of things and really just kind of at large, this idea of performance enhancing drugs in the military, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Is it something that we should be regulating? Is it something that we should be avoiding? I think in any performance endeavor, especially in sport, but now seemingly more so in tactical, performance enhancing drugs are kind of a boogeyman. But I think that there's probably, well, like I said, there's probably some good and some bad that can go along with that. So definitely a fun episode, definitely something that's a little bit different than what we normally do, but I thought it was incredibly interesting nonetheless. hold on. We're starting with the Emmy story. He texts me, he goes, "Oh, he has an Emmy." I was like, "Wait, what?"
Just right place, right time, right team. That was actually part of the team, like a good, cool story. I wouldn't say my job was that complicated, but it was. You work for 3 weeks at the Super Bowl, and you work for the right people, and you. Obviously, I worked hard enough because there's people that I worked with that didn't get nominated, but it was, yeah.
Did you go on stage?
No. So the way those things work, it's like they have like the main Emmys, and then they have all these like technical Emmys, and then like they put in for the whole team because they're trying to say thanks to like all the people that made it happen. Those things are never like out in the open. There's like a press release, and it lists all the side awards and who won them. So you have to it's obscure. You kind of have to find it. So,
but now you have it, and is it in your office?
Oh yeah, it's
Well, he reaches for it.
No.
There it is.
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, I've never seen one of those. Honestly, if I were in there in real life, it might take me a second to oh, that's an Emmy, because I know what an Oscar looks like. Emmy, I guess it's the angel holding the thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm getting way off topic, but
no, for sure. It's funny because it's what people knows, but I feel like I've done like way harder things, and yeah. So
I was like looking through your LinkedIn right before you came on just to like make sure like I knew everything, because like we've only talked about like the stuff you're doing recently pretty much. And I was trying to figure out your journey from like being a SEAL to like the sports broadcasting stuff and like the event planning stuff and all of this. And was your first entrepreneurial effort creating a hair salon?
Yeah, it was. Yep.
That was unexpected for me to stumble across as I went through that.
And that's why we brought him on.
Yeah, no, I mean, entrepreneur, like I've always thought about like back then when I had all these employee problems, I was like, man, I should write a book called The Navy SEAL Hair Salon. But I got an MBA, and we started a family, and we moved to a small town where like you either worked for the government or you started a business, and my wife did hair. So that's what I did. I had like 30 employees at one point, and I ran that thing like, it was a tight ship.
Were there a lot of jokes? Because I mean, no offense, but the thing with SEALs is always the hair and that kind of thing. Did that ever surface, or were you far enough removed?
I don't think anyone who worked for me knew that I was a SEAL. I don't tell very many people.
You have great hair, by the way.
Yeah, I'm losing it, but but yeah, it's I would guess that like probably like 90% of the stylists that work for me did not know that I was a SEAL, because why would they think the owner of a hair salon was a SEAL? I don't know.
You didn't have like a hazing process to select the stylists for your
No, but I did have I have a no drama rule and professionalism, and we did out a lot of people surprising. You just say, hey, there's gonna be rules, and
awesome.
So,
well, we should probably start navigating this thing back towards the original point of this conversation. I don't exactly know like what the lead in for this is, but I'll kind of open it up with what we're going to discuss is like the incident that led to kind of this conversation is absolutely tragic. And like nobody disputes that, but there's a lot of complicating factors that come into it that include a conversation about fitness, a conversation about performance enhancing drugs, a conversation about like when to push through things and when to seek medical attention, a conversation about like ethics and integrity, selection process for special operations. There's so many pieces of this that are relevant to conversations we have on the podcast like this. I guess I'll throw it to you, Jamie. Like, where do you want to start? What do you think people should know?
Yeah, if you want to do an intro, you can kind of get into my background a little if you feel like it, but just to establish some credibility, pre-COVID was running a mentorship program for guys that wanted to go through SEAL training. And it was local, and it was a nonprofit, and so I have a passion for that. And then also just like, obviously, you know, like testing and deciding who's good enough has always been, that's kind of why I started Ready Fit, or am working on starting Ready Fit. So it's, so if you want to like allude to any of that, I won't self-promote too much because it's not my thing, but I obviously want people to think that I'm credible. There's a million SEALs out there that have an opinion too. I'm not the only one, but I feel like the integrity side of it and some of the things that I might have to add are things that other people haven't added or haven't really talked about. So yeah.
Yeah, that was one of the things when Alex and I talked about this, and I'm sure, I mean, we'll talk about the article probably a lot, but that came out relatively recently. And then we wanted to bring this to light because, one, we haven't had the chance to talk to a lot of Navy folks, so thank you for that. But then two, kind of in my experience with special operations, and then even in the conventional Army now, and in really all the branches, there's always this, around human performance, there's always this undertone of performance enhancing drugs, whether those guys, whoever those guys are, they're doing it. Those guys are doing it. You have to do it to get through this. You got to use it to get through that. And I guess the reason why we wanted to chat about it is because one of the things that you mentioned was that there aren't a lot of folks talking about the personal responsibility component of it as it pertains to guys going through selection courses. Everyone looks at the branches and at kind of the leadership to say, hey, what went wrong here? But like you've mentioned, there's a personal responsibility piece of that. So I guess to kick things off from my end, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that side of the argument, as it were.
Yeah. So, you know, I come at it from the point of view that nowadays so many people have decided that their next step in life, their next career goal, their identity is going to be wrapped around being a SEAL. And so many people have sort of pre-told people that that's what they're doing and accepted accolades for their endeavors. And I think that that's created this scenario where people are so tied into making it that they'll do just about anything to make it, because it's kind of hard to back up out of something when you've told your friends, your family, your social network, that you are going to this program and everyone's, you know, giving you kudos or likes or whatever. The fact remains still like 75 to 80% of them don't make it. So those people will then be forced to reconcile with all those people that they told what they were doing. And I think for some people, it causes them to cross that sort of integrity line, which is really kind of important to me. So one of the things that, as we spoke earlier, I just don't think people are talking about his personal responsibility for this. I mean, there's so many factors in this situation that the media conveniently leaves out. You know, let's talk about the fact that his mom knew about it. His mom knew that he was using performance enhancing drugs. That's fine, but you know, as a parent myself, I know there may not be nothing that she could have done. But the fact that he purchased a used car to park off base so that he could store drugs in it, he already knew that if he got caught with drugs, he'd be out of the military. And that part of the story gets left out all the time. And then who knows how many of his classmates were also storing contraband in the car to use. And you know that it's talked about the swimmer-induced pulmonary edema, which for those that aren't familiar with it, it's basically, you know, fluid in your lungs that's caused from exertion in really cold water, and it can lead to pneumonia. So for the layman's term, it's basically could be pneumonia caused by fluid in your lungs. And a lot of people get it because they're swimming in super cold water. So there's a lot of people trying to figure out how they're not going to get it, or, you know, how they're going to make it through if they get sick. But I think the misconception is that they're going to get dropped from the program if they get sick or injured, which just simply isn't true. And maybe there's some education that can be done on that, but just start off, like, you know, on the medical side of things, I think he did receive a great standard of care, probably the best standard of care. And by using performance enhancing drugs, he probably sacrificed some of his own, some of the care that could have been given to him, because it would have been masking symptoms that he may have had if he hadn't shown signs of being otherwise so healthy.
I think I mean, you've addressed it a little bit here, but they talk a lot, and we're going to reference the article a lot as we go through this conversation. For anybody who's like not in the weeds on this one, the article, at least for me, is the New York Times article. It kind of made this pretty mainstream, but they talk about like increasing medical surveillance and stuff, but they blame a lot on like a lax attitude towards medical issues there. But a huge piece of this is like willingness to self-identify as sick or injured. And we know in the military, there's a culture of pushing through things, but he continued to not seek treatment after he had finished Hell Week. Like he had every opportunity to go in for that final screening and explain his symptoms to them. But from my reading of the article, he did not explain those symptoms. He went into the screening, told them he was fine, walked back out of there and moved on with his life. And that to me raises questions about, was he worried about the consequences if they started to look into like his health or whatever else was in his system at that, like when he received medical treatment?
Yeah, I would agree. My first read of that article, having been there and known, like it's like it paints a picture of like this sort of brutal place that like there's no rules, and it's actually quite the opposite. You know, especially during the week that is the culmination of sort of the physical challenging part of it is there are so many eyeballs looking at it and watching it, and there's so many people there that are there to help and make sure that the evolution's conducted safely and no one gets hurt. So to me, my very first impression was, oh yeah, he didn't say anything, because if he did, the first question any doctor's going to ask is, are you taking any medication? And then he would have had to lie. And so that to me like stood out, that like the reporter just kind of conveniently didn't, he talked a lot about it, but then really focused on lack of medical care and has the program gotten too hard. And to me, it's like this tragedy, nobody would even know about it right now had he just sought help afterwards. And I that might sound crass, and people might say, "Oh, you weren't there, you don't know." But I was there, and I told you guys this story before, but back when I went through in the 90s, high prevalence of people taking Motrin as a prophylaxis, like ibuprofen, and not just taking like 200 to 400 milligrams. The military thing was like, take the 800 milligram horse pills. You can take them 4 times a day. Clearly, you can't take that medication in Hell Week because everything that you ingest and drink is watched. But prior to Hell Week, me and probably everyone else took 4 800 milligram Motrins a day just to worry about inflammation, like whether you need it or not. And partway through Hell Week, I was under the boat, dark, throwing my guts out and wondering what was wrong with my stomach. And I didn't say a word to anyone because I was worried that I was going to get dropped or rolled or, and I didn't want to show a sign of weakness either. But after Hell Week, and it wasn't until the Monday after, I didn't say anything after, but I didn't have a reason to hide anything either. I was diagnosed with an ulcer and had to be on ulcer medication for a month. And that was because I was self-treating myself on something that I didn't need. In this case, when you read the article, not only was this young man using steroids, but he was also medicating with Viagra for prevention of SIPE, which is like unproven, not authorized for use. Like maybe nothing goes wrong there, but that he was willing to take anything and do anything to pass the program. And I think maybe it doesn't leave that out, but I think the personal integrity issue on this is what's being missed.
Because I have a very simple question, but I get into, I think, a lot of things, one of which, we talked about this prior, just the physical abilities, like what's actually required to pass this course. So the simple question is, do you think performance enhancing drugs are required for the average person to pass BUD/S? And if not, or if so, what really goes into being successful in the course?
That's a great question. I do not think so. I think, 95% of everyone that goes through the program goes through clean, and that thought doesn't even cross their mind. But there's always going to be, for various reasons, people that have to make it through. When you look at like just the physical things that you have to do, the program's meant to fail at some point because you're not going to be good at everything. You know, you have to be a great swimmer, you have to be a great runner, you have to be good at PT. There's technical skills you have to be good at, you have to be comfortable in the water. There's things that are going to come up that eventually it's not going to be your strength. You know, you have the obstacle course. There's just a whole host of things that, you know, coming in, if you're the best athlete at your local high school and you're used to winning and everything, you're showing up with 200 other dudes that are the same. So you just can't win anything. And I think that weighs on a lot of people. But when you actually drill down to what the standards are for like I will say an endurance athlete, because I think that's really what's kind of missed here is, you know, you have to be, you know, ideally a 7-minute mile runner, and not for like a marathon, but for like 4 or 5 miles. So you have to be able to run a 7-minute mile for, call it 30 to 40 minutes, which like you can, like 40-year-old women can run that fast with the right amount of training. Swimming, same deal. You don't have to be a collegiate swimmer or water polo player. You've got to be basically a sub 10-minute, 500-yard swimmer that's really comfortable in the water. Can it, like, there's going to be people that can't do that, but it's like if you ask a swimmer if swimming 500 yards in 10 minutes is fast when they're doing it in 4.5 or 5, they're going to say that's a joke. That's like the easiest thing I've ever heard, right? So, and you ask a marathon runner if running 7 minutes a mile is fast, like they're going to say that's a joke too. So, and even if you look at the pull-up standards, like I was looking at the Marine Corps standards to get like 100 points on their normal fitness test, it's like 25. Like you have to do, I think, 8 or 10 to qualify for the program. You build up to 20. Most people can do 20, but that's over the course of 5-6 months. So do you need to cheat? No. In this case, I really think that this gentleman wasn't a good runner, wasn't a good endurance athlete. When you think of the right candidates for this program, you think about water polo players, wrestlers, cross-country athletes, swimmers. He was the quarterback for the Yale football team. I mean, so he brings with him a lot of leadership. You know, he seems like he should be the stereotypical like Hollywood SEAL. But I guarantee you, if he was a 19-year-old kid that didn't have that resume, he probably wouldn't have been given as much of a chance as he had been to get to where he was based on some of his fitness scores prior to Hell Week. You know, like everyone's like, hey, he was the quarterback for Yale. Like that sounds really good to us. We could use a guy like that, which is true. But I think there's a lot of contributing factors that the public doesn't think about when you can take a kid that ran cross country in high school that has no leadership experience and probably have a better chance of making it through BUDS or SEAL training than a football player at any high school, because they've spent the last 4 years of their life preparing for something they didn't know they were preparing for.
Do you think, while you're talking, it kind of got me thinking about a follow-on question, which has to do with what we'll call like the Hollywood SEAL archetype, stereotype, whatever you want to call it, that everybody knows it at this point. Like it's probably the most well-known special operations profession that there is. Do you think that the fact that that is the case creates a certain level of risk for everyone involved in these types of programs? And what I mean by that is, if you do have a Division I athlete, swimming, football, whatever, there's almost this preconception. And for me as an objective outsider, when I think of folks going to BUDS, it's always that super elite athlete with this massive resume of accomplishments. And I can imagine going into a program like that, knowing that I am not that type of person, I might try to reach to find some sort of supplementation to help me get to what I think is this perceived level of baseline that I need to be at to even start the program. So I guess, do you think that feeds into this mindset going into it of like, I have to do whatever it takes? And then maybe the flip side on the instructor cadre leadership side, on the Navy side, do you think that there's even the possibility that, hey, we have to uphold this kind of mythical status that BUDS has been elevated to by virtue of everything that we have going on in Hollywood, social media, et cetera? Does that even make sense? I don't know if there was like a constructed question in there.
I think it's easier to answer your second part first, because I think once the guys at SEAL and the instructor staff, like, you know, there's going to be people that may not be as good at or qualified to be instructors in any you guys see it in the Army or the things you've done, like that what qualifies for someone is one thing. But as far as like what those instructors are trying to hold up, most of them they're basing it off of what they know it takes, the right kind of person, the right kind of teammate, what the job is. So I think they're best equipped to make those decisions, because they've all probably spent at least 2 deployments and 5+ years as an active duty SEAL. So on the instructor side, there's no pressure to uphold this like Hollywood standard. If anything, it's the other way. It's this pressure to like, I want to select a guy that I know I needs to carry a 80-pound rucksack and be a good human and a good leader and a good teammate. And if I see this guy being selfish, I don't want him on my team, because I know that's going to cause me problems later. So I think that on the instructor side, there's a lot we could talk about there, but I think for generally, like, no instructor is trying to like uphold like an external persona. On the absolutely on the candidate side, though, part of the problem over the last, like, call it 10 years is the pipeline has gotten so long from when people can decide they want to be a SEAL till they actually check in. And then the ways that people can communicate with each other and find out information. I date myself, I went through in 95, social media wasn't a thing. The internet really wasn't even much of a thing. Email was like pretty novel. Like, people act like we've had email forever, but the way that we communicate with people has greatly changed. And you checked into this sort of mythical, sort of scary place with no information about what's going to happen tomorrow. And the way you got information is you talked to the injured rollbacks in, this place, called the pit, where like on your downtime, you sort of hung out and waited to find out what was next. And you talked to the guys that were there before, and they're like, hey, what are we going to do today? What's next? And you'd kind of get all the info that you could. Where now, like, people have got online manuals of like, hey, on day 1, we're going to do this. And on day 2, because they've just been writing it all down and sharing it. And so you've got all this information, which the reason why I say that is, like, if you had to wait 2 years to go and it's all to you, you think it's about Hell Week and am I good enough to make it through? You start applying a lot of internal pressure on, I wonder if I'm good enough. Am I doing enough? Do I know enough? Like, you just kind of like downward spiral of like more information, more workouts, more whatever. What can I do? And there's tons of examples of that going on in the last 10 years of candidates, some having success and some of that really having so much information that's probably their downfall.
One quick one, because I think we're going to get into like, are the physical tests at BUD/S representative of the physical demands of being a SEAL? I did scroll through just to look at it, and this is not so much a fact check as making sure I'm on like the same page. It didn't refer to him as the quarterback for the Yale football team. It referred to him as the captain for the Yale football team. And I know the position he played as like a state championship high school player was defensive end. So I couldn't really find like something certain on like what position he played for Yale football. Like whether it's quarterback or whether it's defensive end, you're not necessarily talking about like an endurance athlete per se, right? And that's where a lot of these issues come up, is with like tolerance for volume and ability to sustain like a sub-threshold kind of level of work for really long periods. I think there's a question there, because everything you described and everything I've seen, I have not gone into the weeds on like what BUD/S consists of, but it's really a ton of calisthenics, a ton of running, a ton of swimming, and just like doing physical tasks for really long periods of time. And I think that's something that like the culture of fitness we have today, which is going to get weird, but just like the things that are valued as fit on like Instagram or fit on football teams or like on YouTube highlight reels are all very much like speed, power, explosiveness kind of stuff. And it doesn't seem like that's something that's tested very heavily at something like BUD/S. And I don't know how, like, I don't know. I'm wondering if we're testing for the right things. And I'm wondering what kinds of fitness we're looked for once you made it through and you are a SEAL. Like, what did the training look like at that point? And does it match?
Yeah, I think they're testing and training the right things, because it's all endurance focused when they're there. But I think people showing up there have this perception of what they think it is. which is different. I mean, when I coach and mentor people on going there, I'm like, run more, get in shape, be a good runner. You'll have such an easier time if you know how to run. And they're like, okay, I'm running a lot. I'm like, how many miles did you run last week? And if they really went to add it up, they're running 5, maybe 10 miles a week, maybe once or twice. I'm like, you don't have to run 40 miles a week, but you should be doing 15 to 20, 4 days a week. And I would venture to say that many candidates aren't, because they can do 100 push-ups, and so they think that's going to get them by. But the problem is everyone can do 100 push-ups, and it's really easy to point out the guy in last place on a run. If you're struggling on push-ups, no one knows what rep you're on. So it's, yeah, I agree with you or I wouldn't say that. I would say that the perception is that the Instagram perception where, you're this fitness enthusiast or influencer, and you've got to have the right body and you got to be the right thing. When the reality is you kind of have to know how to suffer a little bit. And those are the things that they put you through, that like log PT, like a lot of the services have adopted it, but log PT isn't really testing strength. Those logs aren't that heavy. And especially when you put 6 to 8 guys on them, I couldn't tell you what they weigh. They might weigh 180 pounds, maybe. They're not that they're light, but when you do like 20 overhead presses with them, by the time you get to number 20, it's like that endurance lift. It's not that power lift. And they're not really testing if you have the endurance to do that. They're testing your resolve, because there are going to be things that you're going to do that are going to require resolve, and they want to see if you're going to quit. In this, one of the things in this story that is not fair to the program is, there's this the big push is we're going to select on leadership, character, and competence. Those are the big things. But to get there, you first have to prove if someone has sort of the endurance and the willpower to like just do the job. And so that leading up to Hell Week and maybe a little bit after Hell Week, it's all like, let's make sure that everyone wants to be here, because this job actually sucks really bad when you're packing your bag every weekend and you're freezing cold and you're sitting outside in Alaska or wherever, and you gotta hike 20 miles. And unlike SEAL training, where you always have like a truck parked on the beach as an ambulance, and you can raise your hand and say, hey, I'm out. Like, you can't do that when you're in the middle of the desert or middle of whatever. And so those are the types of things that the program's training you for. So I think absolutely it's teaching people the right things. In this case, he kind of checked the box on leadership, right? If he's the captain of the Yale football team, that's a big plus. But he totally misses the boat on character. And if I had anything to say, like if the program is fault for anything, it's they didn't identify the character issues sooner. I think that they would have, because in the phase that he was in, you're getting 160 to 200 guys. You kind of weed down to the guys that are capable of doing the job, and then you start judging them on character, competence, and leadership.
Do you think, well, you kind of touched on this just now, but do you think the course does a good job selecting for character and competence? And if so, what do they have in place that selects for those things? Because I know, like, in sort of Alex and I's world, and the kind of big army push, and really, I think probably big military push in the next couple of years, but just rolling out human performance to the masses, we'll call it. And then there's this big push to like figure out the intangibles. And I would kind of throw character into that category. And so I'm curious how this course, and from what you've seen, how does it select for that? And do you think that it does a good job?
I think probably like a lot of programs in the military, that's where it's lacking. To be honest, I mean, what they've done some innovative things that other services haven't done. They do like 360-degree peer evals, and they judge people based on what their peers say. There's some pros and cons to that. Like the pros are, you may identify a guy like straight away that's not a good teammate based on what other people are saying. The cons are, the group think, and if a lot of those guys, if there's an accepted norm that you just cheat your way through this and everyone agrees, then that's not really going to show up on that 360-degree peer eval. Also, it doesn't prevent clicks. sort of like the cool club versus the guys that like may have different personalities. So there may be like a really qualified guy that could eventually be a good guy that may not get selected, or be as good with his peers based on like sort of the group of peers that are there. But as far as like competence and leadership, absolutely, because SEAL platoons are so small that everyone's in charge of something. So you pretty much find out quickly if someone can hold their own and be responsible for what they need to be responsible for. I mean, when you're like, even as a new guy, you're going to have a responsibility of something, and if you can't like police yourself and get it done, you'll be gone pretty quickly. And the other thing that's overlooked is like when you talk about Hell Week, it's like really like within the first month and a half, and you still have another basically full year of using the same sort of descriptive words, competence training. A guy could go 3 or 4 months and be at the range, and everyone's like, this guy is a horrible shooter, and he's a safety violation waiting to happen. And it doesn't matter if you made it through Hell Week, you're out. Like you can't shoot, and you're a danger to my teammates. You're gone. And there's plenty of examples of guys that are gone after they've made it through Hell Week. I guess it stings a little bit less because as an individual, you can say, hey, I have what it takes, and I just wasn't good at something. Because people don't look at like quitting or not making the physical part as a competence, when some of it's just a competence. You either have it or you don't.
So this, I mean, not to get long-winded with the answer, because I know that, I mean, Buzz, like you just mentioned, it's a lengthy process, but to me, at least, it seems that for the general public, and really, I think probably for more than that, Buds and Hell Week are synonymous, so much so that like people picture Navy SEAL training and it's just that week on the beach. And then when you're done and you're good to go. But kind of like what you just mentioned, it's a long, kind of drawn out process. Do you think that guys suffer, the guys that get dropped after Hell Week, do you think they suffer from just over preparing for that one snapshot and under preparing for everything else? Because I've seen that happen where guys are monsters in the gym, but their competence as a professional is incredibly lacking because they don't focus on kind of the tactical fundamentals.
Yeah, I mean, I think the program does a good job of selecting candidates, so there's fewer people that fail after Hell Week. But you see, like, the second phase is dive phase for a reason. It's where, SEALs come from the water, despite like what's happened the last 20 years in Afghanistan. Like, and they'll go back to the water and they'll still be called to do the hardest, like, scariest things that people don't want to do because water's involved. And so when people say, oh, you don't need to do all that cold water swimming because it's not going to happen, like, we don't know that, and so you see a fair amount of people like fail dive physics, which, just the classroom stuff, pool competency, which is, short for like just diving with your rigs on in the pool before they take you out to the bay. Everything's incremental, and they do a really good job in the program of building you up and making sure you have the tools to be successful in, small bites. So I would say, like, generally people don't have to do a great job of preparing for the technical stuff, but they do have to be smart. I mean, it's one of the few programs where there's very specific ASVAB score requirements to get into it. So, you have the military ASVAB requirements, and then you have like, hey, here's the other stuff that you have to be smart enough so that when we're talking to you about what we need you to do next, like, we know that you understand what we're talking about.
Do you think, and like we've touched on this a little bit, and it's something I want to like kind of reinforce because it's something we've talked about a lot on this podcast. It's something that comes up all the time. And we've seen it with other special operations organizations as they brought strength and conditioning professionals into what they do. Sometimes people think that like the strength and conditioning coaches are there to like fix it, and everything that has happened before must be bad, and that's why we're here to change everything. And we see some of these programs go very much towards making people very, very strong in like a barbell sense of the term. And they lose some of that emphasis on being able to endure, being able to tolerate some of the suffering of like endurance stuff. But I think they also lose some of like those traditions exist for a reason. The way they train that way, like the reason they train that way, the reason they select for those things exists based on some like pretty legitimate lessons learned about what it takes to do the job. How do we blend like some of the like quote unquote evidence-based or like scientific human performance stuff to introduce some of that strength and conditioning that can help reduce injuries and help people perform better while still respecting some of that? Like there is a reason to include the suffering component in the selection. There is a reason to include the cold water exposure stuff to prepare people for the actual mission set. How do we balance those two things?
That's a good question. I would say first, because not being in like the mainstream military, the SEAL units have always had the benefit of having the best resources and biggest budgets available to them. So some of the things that they're doing with athletic trainers and physical therapists and the tools that are, at least when you make it through and become a SEAL, they have the best resources available, and they're training people for functions of the job. Very similar to things that you were involved with, Alex, with the Army combat fitness test. I mean, there's a lot of here's what you need to do to be able to carry an 80-pound rucksack and build up to it. And they've got the best coaches, and people still have to do the work. As far as balancing for the suffering part of it, I think it is a fine balance. I think the fine balance is the scope creep that you and I spoke about earlier. Just like making sure that the training remains the same that it's been for the last 50 years. Making sure that those standards aren't getting harder. One of the sort of buzzwords or buzz phrases the last few years is the fitter quitter. It's like there's so much information out there that people are fitter than they've ever been, but they're still quitting at the same rate. And you could say that's the program's too hard, or the program is actually testing resolve and people's willingness to endure the same, and it doesn't necessarily matter how fit you are. It's testing those components. I would say that it's the latter, but I think if you're in the other camp, you would say that means the program gets harder every time, and that's a problem, and we should evaluate and see if that's really the case.
Well, that brings up something I was wondering as I was reading the article. It talks about how, like, from the 80s to today, graduation rates at BUD/S, I think overall, I don't know if it was Hell Week specific or BUD/S overall, but the graduation rate has gone down. The number of people that wash out has gotten bigger every class, down to like a 10% pass rate with the class in question with this incident.
I simply think that those were cherry pick statistics. He was in a winter class. Winter classes have very low winter Hell Week classes. People avoid them because they're colder. So there is a little bit of a higher dropout rate in winter classes. You could look at the fact that they're accepting more people into the pipeline to start a class that may not necessarily be qualified, but if you're talking about just straight people that, like, the graduation rates is still like 20 to 25%, that's still the number. You can look at it. Like, I think those are cherry pick statistics, like, to be frank. And I think if anyone did a deep dive on what it actually is, they'd find the same thing.
Let me ask you this, and this is mostly out of curiosity for myself, but also because I think it's relevant to Alex's question. For a special operations group, and I won't just cage this to SEALs, we can kind of comment on whatever, but do you think that there's kind of there's a marketing component to having a low pass rate almost? Like, you can advertise that. And I say this because, you read all these SEAL books, you read all these Green Beret books, you see all this, it's like, oh, we only 5% make it, and I'm one of the 5%, and look at my stuff that I do.
Yep.
Do you have any sense, I suppose, from the inside that is something that is encouraged, or you just kind of let the chips fall where they may, keep the course? Yeah,
I think the Navy's its own worst enemy on that one. Same with pilots. You use pilot programs and SEAL programs for recruiting. Army doesn't have some of the same sort of sexy programs, so otherwise they might not be in the recruiting crisis. I know the Navy doesn't have the same recruiting crisis, but I think they're their own worst enemy because they kind of let it happen, because they know that If we can get someone into the Navy first, that's good. That's good for recruiting. Whether it's right or not, I think because there's so few spots, those spots are always going to fill up. I think the Navy takes advantage of it. I don't think you can necessarily blame them for that. I don't. I think they're a victim of their own success for sure. As far as like people are always going to want to do that, and it's such a small program that they benefit from it.
Yeah, it's discussed in the article, just to like lay it out for people. We talked about the number of people that wash out during Hell Week. Those people are still in the Navy.
Yeah.
Whether they come back to BUD/S again or not, they're still in the Navy. They still have to serve a position. It's just not going to be as a SEAL. And it discusses some of that. And like, you can get a lot of dejected folks out there across the force. We see it a lot. A lot of people end up like through various selection pipelines in the Army. Somewhere along the line, they fall off. It often involves an injury of some kind. So they're like layer onto that. They're rehabbing from some kind of injury. Now they're in a job that they didn't want to be in an organization they didn't want to be a part of. And they like kind of see the like goal they had fading away a little bit. And that can be a serious setback in terms of that person's kind of self-efficacy, hope for the future, all of those things.
Well, one of the key changes, and you bring up a really good point, is Navy first. So in like, call it the early thousands, we were, at the height of conflict and needed more SEALs. And there's a lot of science that came out. How do you become a better SEAL? Where they quickly identified the obvious things, like you need to be a better runner, a better swimmer. Here's the high school sports you can recruit from. So they created a program at boot camp, which was like its own division of people that wanted to be a SEAL. They hired coaches that would help them become better runners and swimmers before they even got to the program. So they had all this information, and it was called prep, and they'd go through prep before they checked in. It was a great program. It definitely worked for the people that took advantage of it. But the downside is it created this special division where when someone came into the Navy, they were automatically special because they wanted to be a SEAL, and they were treated special from the beginning of boot camp until all the way before they got to SEAL training. And then they get SEAL training. They're like, wait a minute, I thought I was special, and this guy's telling me I'm a turd and I'm not worth my salt. Get out of here. Like, that's hard to reconcile when like your first 6 months in the Navy are like, hey, you're awesome, you're special. You show up, and then they're like, no, you're not. So they kind of solve some of the injury problems and the physical prep problems, but then they created this own sort of character issue where people started drinking their own Kool-Aid. And so one of the latest changes that came out just in the last 6 months is they've dissolved those special divisions at boot camp, and you go in and you're with like Gen Pop, if you will. Like you're a sailor first. It's a sailor first Navy. You need to know how to fight a fire on a ship. You need to know how to fold your clothes. You need to do all those things. You need to respect the chain of command so that when a senior officer is talking to you, you don't say, I don't care, I don't know who this guy is, I'm not going to salute him. Like, you're going to have some military bearing. And in the younger generation, I think that's really important. And so that's changed. And then they still have the prep program, but the prep program was moved to Coronado instead of being at Great Lakes. So now you're like the lowest of the low at the totem pole. When you get here, you're not even a student yet. And if you do the right things, we'll let you be a student. So those are changes that really, when this tragedy happened, we're just starting to get rolled out, and no one's really got to see if that's a positive effect, but I think that it is, for a lot of reasons.
Well, I'll ask you one direct question that has nothing to do with the SEAL stuff, but everything to do with the Sailor First Navy concept. On the Army side, we have a pretty good picture of like the foundational physical requirements of soldiering. There's a little bit of load carriage. Like, one of the big ones that comes up all the time is being able to drag a casualty. Like, you can ballpark what that weight is based on like the average size person with body armor, whatever. And I've had this conversation a couple times with Navy people, mostly on Instagram, and sometimes somewhat contentiously because I get in fights on the internet, especially with Navy people. But what you pointed to, able to fight a fire on a ship, that seems to be one of those like foundational, every sailor's got to be proficient in this task. There's a huge amount of effort put into like simulating it at boot camp at Great Lakes Naval Station. What does that look like in terms of physical demands to like be effective on like shipboard firefighting, what are the physical competencies involved in being able to do that effectively?
On the Navy side, from my point of view, I didn't think it was that hard. It was just uncomfortable, right? You're putting in hot gear. It's already hot. You're carrying hoses at the time. I didn't think was that big of a deal. It's really building the camaraderie and the teamwork and the realization that we all have one job to do, and this is the most important job to save everyone's life. It's incredibly uncomfortable. I think that's what they're weeding out for as far as competencies go, but I wouldn't say it's challenging, because firefighting is its own sort of rate in the Navy. So there's going to be guys that know how to turn the pipes on and check the pressure and do whatever it is they do. But yeah, I think that's about what it looks like, but I think just that simple exercise teaches people that they are a part of the Navy, even if they're like, I'm going to go on and do bigger and better things, and this is stupid, you're still exposed to that.
I've just been curious about it because I know a little bit. I know there's like a very different litter that's like specific to like folding out and being able to go up and down stairwells and stay rigid and things like that in like very confined spaces. So I've been curious about been really curious about the physical demands of like moving a casualty around a confined space and all that.
Yeah, I mean, you have lots of people, like I said, it's super uncomfortable. The stairwells are small and it's awkward, but it's like giving a couch to like 4 dudes and saying, move out of this apartment down the stairs and around a corner. Like you can figure it out. Like I mean, that's kind of what it is. But that's why I say it kind of builds the teamwork and the understanding that you're all in the fight together.
As I read this article and as I talk to you, there's 2 dichotomies that come to mind, and I'm interested in your thoughts on them. And one of them, I think, is actually cited directly in this, which is if you ain't cheating, you ain't trying. And ultimately, what we're looking at here is a cheating scandal in the sense that guys are using performance-enhancing drugs. But I would also think that there's an element of that you kind of want in a candidate, the ability to think outside the box, come up with creative solutions, et cetera. So the first one is if you ain't cheating, you ain't trying. And I'm curious as to your thoughts on that. Where does it help and where does it go wrong?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone's sort of familiar with sort of groupthink where you would never do something as an individual because you clearly know it's wrong. But as soon as you kind of get acceptance from the group that what you're doing is okay, then it becomes an accepted norm. And it becomes to a point where it's so bad that you still know that by yourself, you would never make that decision. But as long as you're around these people, then you'll continue to make those bad decisions. So I think that's the biggest risk and the education that needs to happen, because the idea really started with let's be innovative. When you think we're fighting wars and there's no rules, we need to teach people that there are no rules, and you don't have to just because the manual says do it this way doesn't mean you have to do it that way if you can find a better way. And that was sort of what the mantra was meant to be. It wasn't, it kind of got taken out of context, which is if you ain't cheating, you ain't trying, you should cheat all the time at everything, no matter what. And maybe that's one thing that they could just get rid of and say, in fact, they have, and I think what we need to go back to, and you guys probably aren't as familiar with it, or you could Google it, but the SEAL ethos talks a lot about it, and they wrote that to tackle some of these same sort of over publicized issues that the SEAL community was having of what is a true SEAL and what is the expectation. And it really outlines being innovative and being the best, and your word is your bond, and things like that are really good values that sometimes are missed if you summarize that and paraphrase it into if you ain't cheating, you ain't trying, because that's definitely not the SEAL ethos.
And so the second one is less obvious. It's not necessarily quoted, but as somebody who has spent a career as an embedded human performance professional, you're always pushing this message of self-identify, like nothing bad is going to happen if you go and see the athletic trainer or the physical therapist or the strength coach, because there's that cultural shift that I think needs to take place so that people can really take advantage of the care that they have available to them. On the flip side though, and you mentioned this with yourself, we saw it with the individual in the article, we see it all the time in buds, guys masking injury, not reporting it, not seeking help. So I guess what I'm curious about is, does a course like this select for somebody who is less inclined to raise their hand, even when there's really no risk involved, because by that point they would have gotten the trident, they would be a SEAL, they're working with an athletic trainer, but they're the type of individual that's less likely to identify and ask for help. And eventually I'd like to tie this to sort of the mental health discussion, because that's even more of an issue in a paradigm shift of like, hey, if something is wrong, you really need to go and get help, even though for the entirety of your career, it has been to your benefit to kind of mask anything and everything that's been wrong with you.
Yeah, I felt like the article was skewed on this impression that like if he had reported that he was sick, he would have been dropped from the program. And that's simply not true. To talk about psych directly, there's been some all-star, enlisted and officers that have had psych issues in the past and have been rolled back 3, 4, 5 times. I mean, there's guys that for a while had the record for being the longest student because they had good character, they were passing everything, but they had some medical things that kept coming up that kept preventing them from getting through the program. But as far as like it's self-selecting people who don't want to raise their hand, absolutely, because when you're 22 years old and someone says that if you get a bad flu and you miss a day or a couple of days of training, you might be rolled back to the next class, and the next classes are every 2 to 2.5 months. That's an eternity for someone who's like, hey, I've already sort of like budgeted in my mind that I'm going to suffer and go through this sucky program for 7 months. And now I got to add 2 months to that. It's like, I don't think I can do that. And I think that's like, I don't know where you find the fix to that. So I think it's a personality thing, a personal thing. Like when I was young, I was like, and I made it, there's like this mantra, first time, every time, and there's these bragging rights. Like if you didn't get rolled back means you started and finished with the same class. But, like it's probably only half or a little bit less than half of all students start and finish with the same class. And so, trying to teach someone who's young and thinking about time differently, to your point, they'll still eventually be a SEAL and it's a minor setback, but a 2-month setback when you're at SEAL training sounds like an eternity. When you've only been in the Navy for maybe 4 or 5 months, you're like, I gotta wait 2 more months. So
now I'm getting frustrated as you talk about it, because I'm looking back at the article with what you mentioned about like winter classes versus summer classes. And
the winter class is a huge thing.
Yeah, the author does not talk about that at all. And then talks about how like they instituted new protocols and like pass rates have gone up since. But the incident happened in February and the article happened in like July. Of course, pass rates have gone up.
The new protocols are sunshine.
Yeah, and there's a huge like gamesmanship on candidates trying to time like when they're going to get selected for a class so that they don't have to be in a winter class. But I still think that delta is marginal, right? Because like if you're there for 6, 7 months, you're eventually part of that's going to be cold, whether it's in second phase or third phase. Like no one wants to go through Hell Week when it's cold, and I think maybe it was in this article or somewhere I saw it suggested that like maybe they do away with winter Hell Week, but the fact is like summer Hell Week classes just run a heck of a lot more. So if you actually look at it, there's probably a lot more injuries because they're trying to recreate something that's like sort of the endurance factor that's a lot easier to create in the winter, because you can just put someone in the water, they get cold and they're like, oh, I don't like it. In the summertime with the water, which is still cold in San Diego, but you have to spend a lot more time in the water. Maybe they run them a little bit more, they do different things that sort of try to replicate what they're trying to replicate. Yeah.
So I think you've put up a very strong and admirable defense against the article, which there are some holes. So I guess the question, and we've asked this to a couple different guests on a couple different occasions, but in your particular case, if you were given the keys to this whole process, having been through it, seen it evolve over the years, some of your thoughts tonight, like what would it look like? What would you do differently? What would you keep if you had a blank slate?
I don't think I would change anything personally, and I don't think it would be my place to change it. I think they found a program that works. There's like when this investigation is through, and maybe it won't be a published report, or maybe it will be. I think what they're going to find is there is a little bit of scope creep. Like there's going to be instructors that there's this joke, like when you introduce yourself at sort of like a SEAL reunion, you're like, hey, I'm Jamie Monroe, class 200, last hardest class. So it's sort of like this joke, like it gotten easier since. But the fact is, like, there's probably like that's not true, and there's probably some classes that have been a lot harder than even the class that I went through for sure, and I'd readily admit that. But I think that what they'll find is trying to make sure that the standards are in place. There's continuity with instructors, that the best qualified instructors are there, and that it's not possible for a student to get singled out by any one instructor, that there's oversight. And the things we're talking about are maybe new to the public, but they're problems that the training commands dealt with, for 20 plus years. They are aware of them, and they definitely have that oversight. And what we're talking about now is sort of the whatever you call it, the dot on the data chart that's way off to the side, that
Outlier.
it's just an outlier. Yeah, exactly. I was looking for outlier. It's the outliers that happen, like in the case of this. Like, here's a kid who, as an officer, he's a leader. He's doing all these things on the side that nobody's talking about, or nobody knew about, or some people knew about him. And if it's found out that instructors knew that he was cheating, then I think that's obviously a huge problem that I'm pretty sure will get resolved. But if it turns out that it was a kid that was self-dosing with drugs to try to make it through a program, I don't know if the program itself should be forced to change because of one guy. So the other thing too, the article like talks a lot to the 80% who didn't make it, unnamed student who, like, I wonder if any of those unnamed students that came forward about instructors were students that had graduated and passed, and maybe some of them were, but I'm taking the bias that pretty sure if you ask all of the graduates of that class if they were glad they went through and everything that they did, they thought it was meaningful, I think that they would say yes. It's the times that the guy's got his chip on his shoulder, and it's like, if it was only that one instructor or that one thing, and it was so unfair because I missed my run time by 2 seconds and they dropped me from the program. Like, I've heard it all from people. They all have their excuse. At the end of the day, like, their excuse probably is they either weren't qualified, or they didn't prepare, or they had like, a competence issue where they just couldn't do what they were asked to do.
I think this is really interesting because we recorded another conversation recently about like cognitive biases, cognitive fallacies kind of stuff. And we talked a little bit about survivorship bias. And there's an inverse survivorship bias here of, if you only address it with people who did not make it, you're going to get one picture, and you don't really have access to talk to the population that did make it. So you're inherently going to talk to people who did not.
Yeah. I mean, in this whole article, like the military's comment is no comment. The only reason why you guys can talk to me is because I'm not in the military, and there's no like recourse, right? I mean, sure, some of what I'm saying might be speculation. I think it's at least a knowledgeable opinion of someone who's gone through it. But like that, if I can say anything, I hope I'm defending the program as best I can, because I think that, like, when you're only talking about the negatives and not all the goods things that have come out of the program in the last 20 years, I mean, it can't like expect like you had all these people that were ready to kill Osama bin Laden on the spot and actually do it, and then say like the program's too hard. Like people forget, like, one of those helicopters crashed on that mission, and they dealt with that issue and still went through with the mission. Like, there's a lot of things that maybe a conventional unit would have just said, hey, we're gonna cancel this, we're out, like abort. And in this case, like, a lot of things happen that were part of the training that not all units are tasked with.
And I think a takeaway here is, like, no one's arguing that this is not tragic and it should not be investigated and addressed, and like look into the potential drug problem and how widespread it is and all of those things. But I think this is just a chance to talk about kind of the other side. Like, the media will always choose the narrative that invokes the most fear or anger or whatever it is, because that'll get the most clicks and that'll get people riled up. And I think there's an important piece of it here, that there are protocols in place. This is a professionally run program. There is a reason that they put people through this kind of stuff, and it is overseen by like competent medical professionals and all those things. So I think that's kind of the overall message here is, are there issues? Are there risks? Are there concerns? Totally. Are lots of good things in place with people with the best intentions overseeing it in a professional manner? Also, yes.
Yeah, I think the whole side of the article that and I've read through all the New York Times comments, and everyone's like, charge the Navy with manslaughter, standard of care, no medical attention. You guys know I'm in the event business. I'm going to go to Ironman, the World Championships in Kona, and spend 10 days working on the event on various capacities. And they have one of the best medical staffs in the world running that race. It's also one of the most extreme. But the reason why they do is any doctor or emergency physician or whatever would want to be at that race, to be a part of it, to get that exposure. Hell Week and SEAL training is no different. Best doctors, best nurse practitioners, best independent duty corpsmen, like everyone that should be there gets the right to be there. And to say that it's somehow the Navy's fault for not watching out for this guy, I don't know how that same doctor that was asking them that question knows to say, hey, man, did you buy a used car and store drugs in it? And have you been using them for the last 2 months? Like that's not their job. And the whole drug testing issue too is a bigger problem, right? Because you guys being in the military it's a random drug test. Like drug testing is a service function. It's not a SEAL program function, but the article is written as if these guys are pro athletes going to race the Tour de France or on a football team. And they're like, oh yeah, there's just this like, USADA doping program in place that we're just testing these people. No, they're still sailors. They're only getting tested if there's a suspicion of getting tested. And most of the time they're getting tested for, illicit drugs, not steroids. So that's something that they could probably change, and they probably are looking into changing it. But like, imagine running a school and then creating this problem and then going to the Navy and saying, hey, we want to do like, USADA, WADA drug testing for our elite athletes. They'd be like, go pack sand. Our budget's for like, the safety of people, not so that you guys can feel better about your, quote unquote Olympic athletes.
Yeah, no, and I'm glad like that. Again, that's the reason we wanted to have you on, to provide that slightly different opinion than what you see if you just click on the headline on New York Times, which I forget the exact headline, but it was like SEAL student die. Like it's the death. Everything is just dying. And it's good to, I think, get a different story, a different side of things, because it's a conversation. I think there's people on both sides of the fence could probably change things, could probably fix things. But yeah, I mean, your insight is super appreciated. And I know we've kept you long. You told your wife before we hopped on that you had like 45 minutes to an hour, but I don't want you to get in trouble. So very much, Jamie, thank you for your time. Thank you for coming on and talking about this. I know it's something that's close to you, so we appreciate it. Yeah. Thanks, Drew. Appreciate it. We'll make sure you get your second Emmy off the back of this podcast. So. I guess I didn't know that. So. Yeah.